Chapter 1. The Golden Archive. In the American West, a landscape often defined by its harshness and grandeur, there exist smalled with a riot of wildflowers so unique and varied that their perfume on a warm summer's day was said to be intoxicating, and the keeper of the valleys hummed the conductor of its million-winged orchestra was a woman named Beatrice Hawthorne. At 72, Beatrice was the valley's only human soul. She was a woman who had long ago shed the unnecessary words and movements of the outside world, her own rhythms synced to the slow, deliberate dance of the seasons. Her hair was a soft silver white, often caught in a loose, practical braid. Her eyes, the colour of rich amber honey, held a deep, patient calm, the look of someone who had spent a lifetime watching and listening to creatures far older and wiser than mankind. Her hands wrinkled and occasionally graced with a bee's loving sting, moved with a gentle certainty whether she was calming a nervous hive or tending her small, flourishing garden. Her home was a small whitewashed stone cottage built by her father and his father before him. The Hawthorns had been the keepers of the silver smoke bees for 3 generations. They had brought with them a special lineage of bees from the old country bees, known for their gentle temperament and their extraordinary ability to produce a honey of unparalleled complexity. This honey, the colour of liquid sunlight, with a faint silvery sheen that gave the valley its name, was legendary among the connoisseurs and apothecaries who were willing to make the long journey to procure it. Beatrice's life was a liturgy of care. She rose with the sun, not to the sound of an alarm, but to the shifting tone of the hive's pockets of impossible gentleness. The apiary at Abbott's Creek was one such place. Nestled in a sheltered meadow just beyond the town of Willow Creek, it was a world humming with life, a sanctuary painted in the vibrant hues of 1,000 wildflowers. This was the domain of the bee, and its quiet, intuitive queen was a woman named Beatrice Abbott. At 72, Beatrice was a woman whose rhythms were dictated by the sun and the seasons, not by the town clock. Her hair was the silver of a pussy willow in early spring, her eyes a deep, warm hazel that held the patience of the earth itself, and her hands, though weathered by sun and stung by a lifetime of beekeeping, moved with a steady, reverent touch among her hives. She wore simple, practical dresses of calico and linen, often with the faint, sweet and resinous scent of beeswax clinging to her. Her late husband Samuel had been the one to build the first hives, but it was Beatrice who possessed the true gift. She had what the old folks called the bee's sense. She understood the subtle shifts in the buzzing of a hive, the meaning of a particular dance, the precise moment to harvest the honey without disturbing the delicate balance of the colony. For Beatrice, beekeeping was not a trade. It was a conversation, a lifelong partnership with the small winged souls who were the true masters of the meadow. The honey from Abbott's Creek was legendary. It was not the pale, uniform sweetness one found in stores. Each season's harvest was a unique vintage, a liquid archive of the year's blooms. The spring honey was light and floral tasting of clover and wild apple blossoms. The late summer honey was a deep, rich amber carrying the complex, robust notes of goldenrod and aster. Beatrice believed that her honey was more than just a food. It was a distillation of the land's memory, a golden repository of a year's worth of sunshine and rain. Her life was one of quiet, profound purpose. Since Samuel's passing 5 years prior, her world had contracted to this small humming sanctuary. Her only companion was Clara, a frail, quiet girl of 16, whom Beatrice had taken in a year ago. Clara was the orphaned niece of the town's blacksmith, a girl whose spirit seemed as bruised as her health was delicate. She suffered from a persistent wasting cough and a deep, unshakable melancholy that the town doctor's tonics could not touch. Beatrice had begun a gentle regimen of her own. She gave Clara small spoonfuls of her richest, darkest honey, brewed her teas from the linden flowers the bees loved, and simply offered her the quiet healing presence of the API as they stirred to life. She understood their language, the contented hum of a strong queen, the anxious buzz of a coming storm, the furious roar of a hive under threat. Her beehives, dozens of them painted in soft shades of blue and white, were not just her livelihood. They were her family, her congregation, her life's great work. She was not entirely alone. For the past 4 years, she had shared her quiet world with Lily, a bright, gentle girl of 18. Lily was the orphaned daughter of a distant cousin, left adrift in the world until Beatrice had taken her in. In the peace of the valley, under Beatrice's patient tutelage, Lily had found not just a refuge, but a calling. She was learning the ways of the bees, the names of the wildflowers, and the quiet, profound joy of a life dedicated to creating sweetness and light. In Lily, Beatrice saw the continuation of her family's sacred trust, the future guardian of the silver smoke legacy. Theirs was a world of profound, cyclical peace. They harvested honey, rendered beeswax into candles, and salves, tended their garden, and spent the long, quiet evenings reading by the fire. It was a small, perfect universe buffered by the great silent mountains. Beatrice, in her quiet wisdom, knew that no paradise is ever truly safe. She knew that the world of men, with its insatiable appetite for progress, was always looking for new lands to conquer. She simply prayed it would never find its way to her hidden valley. Chapter 2. The Sound of the Axe. The world arrived not with a knock, but with a sound that was a profanity in the sacred silence of the valley, the sharp, percussive echo of a distant axe striking wood. It was a sound of violation, of intrusion. Beatrice felt it, not just in her ears, but as a discordant tremor in the hum of her hives. A few days later, a man rode into her clearing. He was not a familiar face from the nearby town of Fari. In the gentle sun and the calming hum of the hives, a fragile bloom of health had begun to return to Clara's cheeks. The girl was quiet, but her eyes, once dull with sorrow, now held a spark of curiosity as she watched Beatrice work. In Clara, Beatrice saw a spirit in need of mending, and in the task of healing her, she found a balm for her own loneliness. She was nurturing a future not just for the girl, but for the legacy of the apiary itself. Chapter 2. The Man of Miracles. The outside world arrived Prospect Creek. He was a stranger dressed in the practical, hard-wearing clothes of a surveyor, but with a confident, calculating air about him. His name, he announced, was Silas Croft, and he was the chief foreman for the North Star Timber Company. He was polite but direct. His company, backed by wealthy investors from the East, had acquired on a polished new buggy, pulled by a handsome bay horse. The man who drove it was as sleek and confident timber rights to the entire mountain range that formed the western wall of Silver Smoke Valley. They were planning a massive as his rig. His name was Mr. Alistair Sterling, a representative of the newly formed Sterling Botanical Pharmaceuticals logging operation. It will be the largest enterprise this county has ever seen. Croft said, his eyes scanning the Valley Knot Company from Boston. He was a man in his 40s with a sharp, handsome face, piercing blue eyes, and with appreciation for its beauty, but with an appraiser's cold assessment of its resources. We'll be bringing in a voice as smooth and convincing as a finely crafted sales pitch. He was a man of the new age, an age of science, hundreds of men building a lumber mill down by Prospect Creek. It means jobs prosperity. It means progress. Be of progress of miracles that could be bottled and sold. He had come to Willow Creek because of a rumour Beatrice listened, her hands clasped before her, her expression unreadable. The trees you intend to cut are that heard from a colleague in the city, a rumour of a remarkable honey from a remote apiary that seemed to possess unusual healing. Ancient guardians of this valley, Mr. Croft. They hold the soil on the mountainside. They shelter the springs that feed our properties. He arrived at Beatrice's gate, his leather satchel in hand, his city suit a stark creak. They protect the wildflowers from the harsh winds. Croft gave a small, condescending smile, eye dark line against the vibrant chaos of the meadow. He was polite, charming, and professionally curious. He praised the beauty of her ape. I'm sure they do, ma'am. But they are also board feet. They are timber. They are capillary, and the quality of her honey, which he sampled with the discerning palate of a connoisseur. Remarkable, Mrs. waiting to be unlocked. We are of course aware that your small apiary is located here. The company has authorized Abbott. He said, his eyes gleaming with an intensity that went beyond simple appreciation. Truly remarkable. The floral notes are complex, unique. He explained his purpose. His company was at the forefront of modern medicine, dedicated to isolating the active compounds to make you a very generous offer to buy you out to compensate you for the disruption. You could move to town, live in comfort. My bees and I are not disrupted by the seasons, Mr. Croft, in natural substances to create powerful, reliable remedies. He asked if he might purchase a large sample of her latest harvest for scientific analysis. Wary but polite, Beatrice agreed, selling him several large jars of her prized late summer honey. We are a part of them, Beatrice said, her voice quiet but resonant. The flowers that grow on that Mr. Sterling left promising to be in touch. For 2 weeks, the peaceful rhythm of the apiary returned. Then mountain are the source of our honey. Without the flowers, my bees will starve. Without my bees, the flowers of the polished buggy reappeared at her gate. This time, Mr. Sterling's face was not just charming, it was alight. The valley will not be pollinated. You speak of cutting down trees, but what you are truly proposing is to silence this with a feverish, triumphant excitement. Mrs. Abbott, he began, barely able to contain himself. I bring entire valley. Croft's patience visibly thinned. He saw a stubborn old woman, blind to the practicalities of the world. Mrs. Hawthorne, he said, his tone hardening. With all due respect, this you astonishing news. Our laboratories have confirmed it. Your honey contains a unique, previously undiscovered pollen concentrate, a compound that is happening. Our legal rights are ironclad. The contracts are signed. The first survey teams are already at work on has demonstrated extraordinary restorative properties in our tests. It's the source of your honey's magic. He set the far side of the mountain. I am offering you a kindness, a way to leave with your dignity, and a full his satchel on her porch table, and opened it, revealing not jars of honey, but neat stacks of papers. This purse. I suggest you take it. He tipped his hat, turned his horse, and rode away. Leaving the compound, he continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush, could be the basis for a new line of medicines, echo of his words, hanging in the air like the smell of sawdust. The distant rhythmic sound of the axe returned tonics for respiratory ailments, balms for wound healing. The possibilities are endless. It could change the face of modern harbinger of the destruction to come. Chapter 3. The Divided Town. Beatrice knew she could not fight the medicine, and it could make you a very wealthy woman. He laid out his proposal. It was breathtaking in its scale. He North Star Timber Company with legal arguments. They had the power, the money, and the law on their side. Her only hope wanted to buy her land, all of it. His company would establish a large-scale modern apiary. Was to appeal to the hearts and minds of the people in Prospect Creek, the small town that lay just beyond the valley production facility. They would clear the surrounding meadows of their chaotic, inefficient wildflowers and plant acres upon acres of a single specific's mouth. But when she and Lily rode into town for supplies, a week later, they found a community-transformed purple wildflower, the one his scientists had identified as the source of the miracle compound. They would bring in modern hives, scientific. The air buzzed with a new feverish energy. Silas Croft had been true to his word. He had set breeding techniques and a team of workers. Beatrice would be given a lifetime stipend, a fortune beyond anything she could imagine up a hiring office in the saloon, and was offering wages that seemed astronomical to the local farmers and ranchers who were used to scraping by, and a place of honor as the founder of the project. He presented it as the opportunity of a lifetime. The town was divided. Some, the older families who had known the Hawthorns for generations, looked at a chance to share her gift with the world, a fusion of her rustic wisdom and his modern science. Beatrice listened to Beatrice with sympathy and concern. But many others, particularly the younger men with families to feed, saw her as an obstacle. "Beatrice, you have to understand," said Mr. Gable, the owner of the general store, a man she slow cold horror creeping into her heart. He was speaking of destroying the very thing that made the honey special. He had known for 40 years. My boy, he got a job with the timber company. For the first time didn't understand. He saw her meadow as a chaotic mess to be improved. He saw her bees as production units. He had isolated one flower, one note in a grand symphony and declared it the entire song. Mr. He can save for his own piece of land. This is a chance for our children. At what cost, Henry? Sterling. She said, her voice quiet but firm when he had finished his grand presentation. You have misunderstood, she asked softly. What good is a piece of land if the water in the creek runs muddy with silt from? The healing is not in one flower. It is in all of them. It is in the clover and the thistle, the bare mountainside. But her words were lost in the roar of promised prosperity. She was no longer just the goldenrod and the fireweed. It is in the soil of this meadow and the water from the creek. It is in the clusive beekeeper. She was the woman standing in the way of progress. Lily, who had friends in town, felt conversation between the bees and the land. You cannot put that in a bottle. Sterling's smile became a mask the chill most acutely. Young men who had once courted her now avoided her gaze. Girls she had grown up with whispered behind, of patronizing patience. My dear Mrs. Abbott, that is a lovely, poetic sentiment. But science deals in facts, not their hands when she passed. The isolation of the valley, once a comfort, was beginning to feel like a prison. Crow poetry. We have isolated the active ingredient. The rest is anecdotal, superfluous. The life-after master manipulator of public opinion capitalized on this. He never spoke ill of Beatrice directly. Instead, he would, "My bees is not superfluous," she said, her voice gaining a steely edge. "You are asking me to sell the buy drinks for the men in the saloon and talk wistfully about the future, about a new schoolhouse, a bigger soul of this place." The answer is no. Alistair Sterling was not accustomed to hearing the word "no church," a town their children would be proud to inherit, all built with the prosperity from the timber company he made. He looked at her, a stubborn old woman in a faded calico dress, and he saw not a guardian. Beatrice's quiet, nature-bound existence seemed selfish and backward. The survey crews moved closer, their coloured ribbons appearing but an obstacle that stood between him and a medical revolution and a vast fortune. I see like ugly wounds on the ancient trees at the very edge of the valley. The sound of the axes grew louder. The hum of the he, said his voice, losing its warmth. Perhaps you will reconsider when you understand the benefits this project will bring to the entire hives. Seemed to grow more anxious each day. Beatrice knew she was losing. She was trying to fight a forest fire with a teaspoon community. Progress. Mrs. Abbott has a way of sweeping aside such romantic notions. Chapter 3 of Water. Chapter 4. The Language of Honey. One evening, as Beatrice sat in despair, her gaze, the promise of progress. Alistair Sterling was a masterful strategist. Rebuffed by Beatrice, he turned his attention to the town of Willow Creek. He rented a room at the hotel and began a campaign to win the hearts and minds of fell upon the shelves in her pantry. They were lined with jars of honey, each one glowing like a captured sun. The community. He spoke of a brighter future. He promised jobs at his new modern facility. He promised a share. There were jars from different seasons, different years. She had the pale, delicate honey from the spring wildflowers, the rich of the profits for the town treasury, enough to build a new schoolhouse and repair the bridge. And he promised access dark honey from the late summer fireweed and the incredibly rare, almost mythical honey from the moonbloom, a flower to his new miracle, cure a tonic that would banish the coughs and fevers that plagued the town every winter. To that bloomed for only a few nights each year in the highest, most inaccessible parts of the mountain. She knew her honey was a community that had seen its share of hardship and loss. His words were a potent, seductive song. He cleverly identified the landowners of the meadows surrounding Beatrice's apiary farmers, who saw their fields of wildflowers as little more than inefficient extraordinary. Thomas, her husband, a quiet man with a surprisingly poetic soul, had once said Beatrice this pasture. Sterling offered them prices for their land that were far beyond their wildest dreams. He didn't need to buy Beatrice honey is not just food. It is the valley distilled. It is a library of every flower, every ray of sun's land. He realized if he could control everything around it, he would create his monoculture and her every drop of rain. It is the valley's soul in a jar. His words sparked an idea. Bees would have no choice but to feed on it or starve. He would take her magic by force of industry, a desperate, audacious plan. She could not make the townspeople understand the complex ecology of the valley. She could not fight. The town was quickly won over. Mayor Thompson became Sterling's most vocal supporter. The blacksmith began dreaming of contracts the timber company's legal contracts. But perhaps she could make the world understand the value of what was about to be lost. Lily, she said, her voice filled with a new quiet urgency. Go for new equipment. The mothers of the town whispered excitedly about a future free from winter sickness. Beatrice became a pariah. She was seen as a strange, selfish old woman, hoarding her gift, standing in the way of prosperity, and fetch the special packing crates, the ones lined with velvet. The state capital annual fair was in 1 month for everyone. Children who once waved to her on the road now looked away. The friendly chatter at the general store was time. It was the largest and most prestigious fair in the territory, attracting visitors, merchants, and journalists from all over the seas when she entered. The isolation was a pain deeper than any bee sting. Clara, fiercely loyal, was her only country, and its most fiercely contested event was the agricultural pavilion's honey competition to win the coveted Golden Skep Award defender. They don't understand Mrs. Abbott, she would say, her eyes flashing with anger. At the state fair was to be declared the finest honey producer in the entire region. Beatrice had never bothered with. They don't see what he's trying to do. They see what he is offering child Beatrice such things. Her honey was for her community, for those who sought it out. But now the competition was not, would reply sadly. And it is hard for a hungry man to turn down a feast even if the food is poisoned. About pride. It was about survival. It was her only hope. If she could prove on a public stage that the first ploughs arrived. Across the creek, the ancient wild meadow belonging to Farmer Hemlock was torn asunder. The rich honey was not just good, but a unique and irreplaceable treasure. It might create a story powerful enough to counter Croft's narrative of tapestry of wildflowers turned to black barren earth. The sight was a knife in Beatrice's heart. The sound of the plough progress. This became their new purpose. Beatrice, with her lifetime of knowledge, selected the perfect honeys. She chose was a funeral dirge for her bees. Chapter 4. The Whispering Sickness. As autumn, the spring blossom for its delicate complexity and the fireweed for its bold, rich flavour. And for her deepened a strange malady began to move through Willow Creek. It was not a violent fever or a dramatic plague. It was a final entry. She chose the rarest of them all, the silver smoke moonbloom, a honey so fragrant and ethereal, quiet creeping sickness. It started in the children, a dry, persistent cough that settled deep in their chests. It left, it was said, to taste like starlight. Lily, with her steady hands and artistic eye, prepared the entries. She filled them pale, listless, and unable to shake a profound weariness. The town doctor called it a wasting cough and prescribed his usual array of tonics and syrups, but they had little effect. The sickness lingered, draining the vitality from the special hexagonal glass jars, sealed them with pure white beeswax, and wrote the labels in her most beautiful script. Their work was a quiet, focused rebellion, a desperate prayer being packed into a crate. Chapter 5. A town's youngest and most vulnerable. Mr. Sterling, seeing an opportunity, magnanimously offered the town a desperate journey. The journey to the state capital was an ordeal. It was the first time in over 20 years that Beatrice's preliminary batch of his new Sterling's restorative tonic derived from the compound he had isolated. A wave of relief, and had left her valley for more than a day. The world outside felt loud, fast, and jarring. The train ride was a gratitude swept through the town. Here was the promised miracle. But the miracle failed to materialize. The tonic seemed to help clattering, smoke-filled nightmare that rattled her bones and her spirit. The city was a chaotic labyrinth of noise for a day or two, but the deep, racking cough always returned. The children remained weak. Stirling was baffled crowds and strange smells. Lily, who had never been on a train or seen a city before, was both terrified and fascinated. She clung to Beatrice's side, her eyes wide. Beatrice, despite her own discomfort, was, and frustrated, blaming the preliminary nature of his formula and promising better results once his factory was operational. But a seed of doubt had a pillar of calm for the girl navigating the strange new world with a quiet, unshakable dignity. They found been planted in the town's mind. One evening, Martha Gable, the postmistress, came to Beatrice a modest room in a boarding house near the fairgrounds. The fair itself was a bewildering spectacle of agricultural marvels, industrial's gate. Her young son, Timmy, was one of the worst afflicted. Her face was etched with fear innovations and sideshow hucksters. It was the world of Silas Croft, a world that celebrated size, speed, and sleeplessness. Beatrice, she said, her voice a desperate whisper, I know the town has treated you poorly, but I am at my wit's end. The doctor can't help. Mr. Prophet. Beatrice felt like a ghost, a relic from a forgotten time. They delivered their carefully packed crate to the agricultural pavilion, a vast hall filled with hundreds of entries from all over the territory. She saw the other honey entries, many. Sterling's medicine is useless. Timmy, he just gets weaker. I remember you gave my mother a balm for her lungs years ago. I don't suppose. Beatrice looked at the distraught mother and her from large commercial apiaries, their labels boasting of modern techniques and mass production. Her 3 simple hand-labeled jars looked small and insignificant by comparison. A wave of doubt washed over her. What was she thinking? How could her heart felt no triumph, only a deep, sorrowful compassion? Of course, Martha, she said gently. Bring him to me. Chapter 5. The Old Ways. Martha brought Timmy to the apiary the next day. Quiet homespun truth possibly compete in this loud, boastful world. We have done what we can, Lily, she said, her voice betraying a hint of her weariness. Now we must let the honey speak for itself. The boy was pale and thin, his breathing shallow. Beatrice did not offer a single miracle cure. She began a patient. Chapter 6. The Judge's Palate. The day of the judging was nerve-wracking, holistic regimen. She had Timmy breathe in the steam from a kettle of boiling water infused with thyme and mull. Beatrice and Lily sat in the audience watching as a panel of 3 judges, stern-faced men in dark suits, worked Lynn from her garden. She made him a soothing tea from linden flowers and honey, and she gave him a small their way through the dozens of entries. They would dip a small silver spoon into a jar, taste a tiny amount, make spoonful of a special dark, almost black honey one she had harvested years ago from a grove of ironwood trees, deep a note on their clipboard, and move on. Their expressions were unreadable. They tasted the commercial honeys, nodding in the hills a honey she saved for the most serious ailments. She wrapped him in a warm blanket and had him simply politely. They tasted the fruit blossom honeys and the clover honeys. The hours crawled by. Finally, sit in a chair near the hives, breathing in the clean, resinous air and listening to the calming hum. They reached the small, unassuming jars from Silver Smoke Valley. The head judge, a formidable-looking man named, sent Martha home with a jar of the ironwood honey and a bundle of herbs with careful instructions. She asked for nothing in Judge Hemmings was known throughout the territory for having the most discerning palate. He was a connoisseur of fine return. Within 3 days, the change in Timmy Gable was undeniable. The deep cough began to lessen. Foods and wines, and his verdict was considered law. He dipped his spoon into Beatrice's spring blossom honey. Hint of colour returned to his cheeks. He began to eat again. A week later, he was running and playing tasted it. He did not move on. He paused, a look of profound surprise on his face. He tasted it again, this his energy restored. Word of Timmy's recovery spread through Willow Creek, not as a shout, but as a time closing his eyes, his expression one of deep, intense concentration. He whispered something to the other judges, who then whisper. It moved through the network of mothers from kitchen to kitchen, over fences and at the general store. Another tasted it as well, their own eyebrows raised in surprise. They moved to the fireweed honey. Again the same reaction. Mother came to Beatrice's gate, then another. Beatrice helped them all. She never spoke a word against Mr. A long pause. A second taste. A murmured consultation. Finally Judge Hemmings reached for the last jar, the one labelled Silver Smoke Moonbloom. He opened it, and even from a distance, Beatrice imagined. Sterling or the doctor. She simply shared her knowledge, the wisdom passed down to her, the gifts of her land. She explained that the sickness was not just in the lungs, but in the whole body's weakness. Her remedies were not the ethereal scent rising from the jar. He dipped his spoon in lifting the silvery, shimmering liquid. He put it in, designed to attack the cough, but to strengthen the child. Slowly, quietly, the tide of opinion in Willow Creek began to his mouth. Judge Hemmings did not move for a full minute. He sat with his eyes closed, a look of utter rapturous astonishment on his face. It was as if he were not just tasting honey, but experiencing a memory, a turn. The people saw the ploughs on the horizon and the barren fields, and they saw the healthy children who had been healed. Poem, a piece of music. He slowly opened his eyes, and they were shining with an emotion that looked like reverence. He not by a modern bottled promise, but by the gentle, holistic wisdom of the woman they had shunned. They stood up, cleared his throat, and addressed the silent, expectant hall. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice began to understand what they were on the verge of losing. Chapter 6. The Empty Promise. A booming. In my 30 years of judging agricultural products, I have tasted the finest foods this territory has to offer. Lister Sterling was not a stupid man. He saw what was happening. His frustration grew into a cold fury. I have tasted good honey. I have tasted great honey, and I have tasted excellent honey. He paused. Picking saw his grand project, his reputation, his fortune being threatened by an old woman and her folk remedies. He upped the small jar of moonbloom honey and holding it up for all to see. But this, he said, redoubled his efforts. He called a town meeting intending to reassert his authority and discredit Beatrice. He stood, voice filled with a passion that shocked the audience. This is not honey. This is an act of God. This before the townspeople, his demeanor confident, his voice booming. He spoke of the scientific certainty of his methods and dismissed is what a forgotten corner of paradise must taste like. I do not know where Silver Smoke Valley is, but Beatrice's success as a combination of luck and the placebo effect. These are old wives' tales, he declared. I can tell you this, it is a treasure that must be preserved at all costs. He looked down at his clipboard. We are on the cusp of a new era of scientific medicine. Are you going to let superstition and nostalgia drag you? The winner of this year's Golden Skep Award and the finest honey I have ever had the privilege back into the dark ages, but his audience was different now. Their faces were not filled with hopeful awe, but with of tasting in my life is the Silver Smoke Moonbloom from Mrs. Beatrice Hawthorne. Chapter new, quiet skepticism. When he had finished, a man stood up in the back. It was Mr. Gable 7, the unforeseen consequence. The victory was stunning, but Beatrice knew it was not enough. The postmaster. Mr. Sterling, he said, his voice steady. I am a man whose prize was just a prize. It wouldn't stop a timber company with ironclad contracts. But she had not counted believes in progress. I was excited about your project. But I have seen your science, and I have seen my son on the presence of a young idealistic journalist from a prominent San Francisco newspaper. He had been sent to the fair to, your tonic is a promise in a bottle. What Mrs. Abbott gave us was a cure in a jar. They write a colourful piece about the agricultural bounty of the territory, a story of progress and prosperity. But he had been in is a difference. Then Martha Gable stood beside her husband. He's right, she said, her voice ringing with the audience during the honey judging. He had seen the look on Judge Hemmings's face. He had heard his passionate impromptu speech. His reporter's instincts told him that this was the real story. He found Beatrice and conviction. Mrs. Abbott didn't just give us honey. She gave us her time. She gave us her wisdom. She taught us how to care for our own. You want to sell us a product. She reminded us how to be Lily as they were packing their prize. He introduced himself as Thomas Gable and asked if he could interview her. Wary a community. A murmur of agreement swept through the room. Alistair Sterling looked out at the sea of faces, but sensing an opportunity, Beatrice agreed. She did not tell him a story of conflict. She did not rail against the timber, and for the first time, he saw that he had lost. He had won the legal arguments he had bought the company. She simply told him the story of the valley of her family's bees, of the delicate dance between the flowers and land. But he had lost the people. He had tried to buy the town's future, but he had insulted the seasons. She spoke of the moonbloom and how it only grew on the highest, most ancient part of the mountain, its soul. Chapter 7. The Bee's Verdict. The final verdict, however, came not from the people, the very part the timber company planned to clear-cut first. She made him taste the honey, and he too, but from the bees. Sterling's first crop of the single purple wildflower came in a beautiful but unnatural, was silenced by its beauty. Gable's article was published a week later. It was not buried in sea of uniform colour. His own imported bees housed in his modern efficient hives produced a honey that was pale the agricultural section. It was on the front page. The headline was simple and powerful, a taste of paradise thin and medicinally inert. It contained the compound, yes, but it lacked the synergistic magic of Beatrice's honey. Can a spoonful of honey stop the march of progress? The story was a sensation. It was a perfect narrative, it did not heal. Worse, Beatrice's bees, deprived of their diverse meadows, began to suffer. Her for a nation that was beginning to feel a sense of loss, a nostalgia for the wild, untamed beauty that was rapidly. Hives grew weaker. The honey they produced was less potent. The land, once a vibrant tapestry, was becoming a sterile disappearing. It was the story of a wise, dignified old woman, the last of her line, protecting a secret Eden one-dimensional factory floor. The failure was undeniable. Stirling's reductionist science had been proven wrong. The magic against a faceless, rapacious corporation. It was a story people were hungry for. The article was reprinted in newspapers. In was not in the part. It was in the whole. Chapter 8. The Restoration Defeated, and Chicago in Boston in New York. Letters began to pour into the governor's office. The influential National Botanical Society, citing humbled Alistair Stirling, left Willow Creek. His project was abandoned. He left behind fields of a useless flower and a community that the article began to make inquiries about the unique flora of the region. The owner of the North Star Timber Company A was just beginning to understand the true nature of wealth. The town, led by a shamed and remorseful mayor, wealthy industrialist in Boston named Mr. Alistair Blackwood, was a man who cared deeply about two things. Prophet Thompson came to Beatrice. They asked for her forgiveness and her guidance. How could they restore what had been broken, Beatrice and his public image? He suddenly found his company being portrayed as a villain in a popular national drama. Prominent society, with Clara, now a knowledgeable and passionate apprentice at her side, led the effort. The restoration was a community project. Ladies whose husbands were his investors began to ask him at dinner parties if he was truly going to be the man who the farmers who had sold their land worked to replant the meadows using seeds of the native wildflowers that Beatrice had carefully saved. Killed the taste of starlight. The pressure became immense. For a man like Blackwood, bad press was more costly than lost timber. Chapter 8. The Silence of the Axe. A month after the fair occurred for years, the whole town, from the blacksmith to the school children, came to help. They were not just planting flowers. They were telegram arrived for Silas Croft at his office in Prospect Creek. It was from the company headquarters in Boston. It read, "Replant in their community's soul." It took years. But slowly, painstakingly, the wild, chaotic, beautiful diversity of the simply all operations in Silver Smoke region suspended indefinitely. Await further instructions. Meadows began to return, and with it, the health and vitality of Beatrice's bees returned. The honey they produced was Blackwood. The sound of the axe fell silent. Croft, his authority and his project collapsing around him, left once again complex, potent and magical, a golden archive of a restored and resilient land. Chapter 9. Town in Disgrace. The survey ribbons on the trees began to fade and tatter in the wind. The town of Prospect Creek was the Nook. Years later, Beatrice, now frail, but with eyes as bright as ever, sat on her porch, watching initially resentful, blaming Beatrice for the loss of their promised jobs. But the story had changed them too. The famed Clara, now a confident young woman, expertly tending the hives. The air was thick with the scent of 1,000 different flowers, and of the silver smoke honey brought a different kind of prosperity. Merchants, scholars, and wealthy travelers began to make the vibrant, life-affirming hum of millions of bees. Clara brought her a small spoonful of the newest honey. It the journey to the small town, not for timber, but for a taste of paradise. Mr. Gable's general store was a deep, warm amber, and it tasted of sunshine, of resilience, of 1,000 small forgotten flowers that to stock Beatrice's honey, selling it for a handsome price to the stream of visitors. The town discovered that its greatest had been given a second chance. It tasted of memory. Beatrice smiled. The legacy was safe. Her small asset was not the timber to be cut, but the unique beauty that had been there all along. Chapter Nook of the World. This sanctuary of buzzing life and golden memories had faced the cold logic of the modern world and had answered. The future of the hive, Beatrice and Lily returned to their quiet valley. The peace had returned, but it was it, with the undeniable, holistic truth of nature. The whispers of the past had been protected, and the future was humming a new, more resilient kind of peace, one that had been tested and had held. Their relationship with the town was with life. Thank you for joining us in the quiet meadows healed, replaced by a new profound respect. Lily, who had journeyed into the loud world of men and had, of the Story Nook. We believe that the greatest wisdom is often found in the patient observation of the natural world, and seen a different kind of strength win the day was no longer just an apprentice. She was a partner. She had found that the sweetest memories are the ones preserved with love. If this story of a beekeeper's gentle strength resonated with her voice and her purpose, she was the future of Silver Smoke Valley. One evening, as the sun you please consider liking and subscribing. We look forward to sharing our next chapter with you from another corner of the world set, casting a silvery smoke-like haze over the valley. Beatrice and Lily sat on their porch, listening to the contented hum of the hives. You saved it, Beatrice Lily said softly. You saved everything. Beatrice looked out at the valley, at the mountains that stood like ancient sleeping guardians. No, child, she said, a gentle smile on her lips. The valley saved itself. It simply needed someone to translate its language for the world. She held out her hand, and a single bee landed gently on her finger. Its wings a blur of motion, its hum a tiny perfect note in the grand symphony of the valley. It was the sound of life, of legacy, of a sweetness that would now endure. In her quiet nook of the world, she had protected the future, one spoonful of honey at a time, where quiet truths reside.